stop. Listen to the silence before the storm. What you are about to read is the story the mainstream media tried to bury the moment the script flipped on the political elite. They thought this would be just another routine interview, another puff piece for a governor who thinks he's untouchable. They were wrong. Before we step into the arena, if you are tired of the lies, if you stand with the silent majority who demand the truth, make your voice heard right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment "Veterans First" below. Signal to the algorithm that we are watching. Now, let's go to Los Angeles, where the lights are hot, the air is cold, and the reckoning is about to begin. The air inside the Burbank studio was thin, recycled, and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive hairspray. It was a hostile environment by design, a coliseum built of glass and steel where the temperature was kept at a freezing 65 degrees to keep the talent from sweating under the rig. Above, the studio lights cut through the gloom like searchlights on a prison yard, pinning the occupants to their chairs. Governor Gavin Newsom sat on the left, the picture of relaxed, aristocratic confidence. He was leaning back, one leg crossed over the other, adjusting the cuff of a suit that cost more than most American families spend on groceries in a year. He flashed that signature smile, the one that had graced a dozen magazine covers, at a nervous production assistant who was dusting lint off his lapel. "Make sure the lighting catches the left side," Newsom quipped, his voice smooth as expensive scotch. "The shadows were a bit harsh last time." He checked his reflection in the monitor, practicing a look of furrowed, statesman-like concern. To him, this wasn't a debate. It was a coronation. It was just another stop on the tour, another opportunity to speak in flowery paragraphs about equity and future-proofing without ever saying a damn thing. Opposite him, sitting in the shadow of the cameras, was Karoline Leavitt. She didn't have an entourage. She didn't have a makeup team fussing over her hairline. She sat with her spine fused to the back of the chair, her posture rigid, her eyes locked forward. On the glass table in front of her there were no binders full of talking points, no tablet loaded with poll-tested responses. There was only a single, folded piece of paper. It was creased down the middle, worn at the edges as if it had been carried in a pocket for days. A producer with a headset scurried over to her, clipping a lavalier mic to her navy blazer. "Okay, Karoline, remember, we want a conversational tone today," the producer whispered, his tone patronizing. "Let's try not to talk over the governor. We want a civil discourse." Karoline didn't look at him. She looked past him, straight at Newsom, who was currently laughing at a joke from the floor director. "I didn't come here for a conversation," she said, her voice low but cutting through the studio chatter like a razor wire. "I came for answers." The producer blinked, unsettled by the cold intensity in her eyes, and backed away. 30 seconds to air," the floor manager shouted. The room shifted. The casual chatter died instantly. The red, on-air tally lights flickered to life on the cameras, staring like unblinking robotic eyes. Newsom straightened his tie, instantly shifting into his persona, the compassionate, forward-thinking leader. "In 5, 4, 3... The moderator turned to the camera. "Good evening. Tonight we discuss the future of the Golden State and the crisis at the border. Joining us is Governor Gavin Newsom and Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt." Newsom didn't wait for the first question. He leaned into the mic, turning on the charm that had fooled millions. "It's great to be here," Newsom began, his hands gesturing expansively. "You know, when we talk about California, we're talking about a beacon of hope, a place where compassion meets innovation. We are leading the nation in equity, ensuring that every person, regardless of status, has a roof over their head and a chance at the American dream." He paused for effect, waiting for the applause light. But the applause didn't come. Instead, a voice cut through his rehearsed monologue, sharp and undeniable. "Governor," Karoline said. She didn't raise her voice. She dropped it, grounding the room. "You keep using that word, compassion." Newsom's smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. He turned to her, a look of mild annoyance crossing his face, like a king interrupted by a peasant. Karoline leaned forward, her eyes drilling into his. You post about equity from your vineyard. But where is the compassion for the veterans sleeping on the concrete less than 5 miles from this studio? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was the sound of a fuse being lit. Newsom opened his mouth to spin, to pivot, to charm, but for the first time in a long time, the script wasn't going to save him. The fight was on. Gavin Newsom didn't flinch. He had been trained for moments like this, groomed in the fires of San Francisco politics where evasiveness was an art form. He merely adjusted his silk tie, a flicker of condescension dancing in his eyes, and leaned back into the plush chair as if settling in for a fireside chat. "Karoline," he said, dragging out her name like a disappointed schoolteacher addressing a petulant child. "I appreciate the passion, I really do, but we have to look at the macro level. The housing crisis is a complex, multifaceted issue that affects every Californian. We are investing billions in—" "Stop," Karoline said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Newsom blinked, his mouth hanging open mid-syllable. He wasn't used to being interrupted, certainly not by someone he considered a junior staffer in the grand hierarchy of political power. He raised a manicured finger to silence her, but Karoline was already moving. She wasn't waiting for permission. "You keep hiding behind the word complex because you're afraid of the word priority," she said, her voice steady, devoid of the hysteria he was hoping for. "There is nothing complex about a Vietnam veteran who lost his leg for this country sleeping under a tarp in Skid Row while you pay for sanctuary hotels in Beverly Hills for people who broke our laws to get here." A gasp, sharp and audible, rippled through the studio audience. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Newsom's smirk faltered. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking in the dead silence. "That is a gross oversimplification," he shot back, his tone sharpening, losing its polished veneer. "We provide services for all human beings. That is who we are as a state. We don't check papers before we offer a hand." "No, you don't check papers, you check polls." She reached into her blazer pocket. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a gunslinger unholstering a weapon. She pulled out the folded piece of paper, the one she had been guarding in the green room. It was just a sheet of standard printer paper, but in the high-definition glare of the studio lights, it looked like a death sentence for his narrative. "You want to talk about investments?" she asked, unfolding the page. The sound of the paper crinkling echoed through the studio, louder than the ambient hum of the cameras. She held the paper up. Her eyes didn't scan the page. She knew the numbers by heart. She was staring directly at him. "Last fiscal year," she began, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell, "you allocated $4.7 billion for migrant health care. You allocated another $1.2 billion for housing assistance specifically for undocumented immigrants." She paused, letting the billions hang in the air like smoke. Newsom looked toward the moderator, silently pleading for an intervention, for a commercial break, for anything. But the moderator sat frozen, pen hovering over a notepad, stunned by the ambush. "And for veteran services," Karoline continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "for the men and women who carried rifles in foreign desert so you could sit in this air-conditioned studio, $190 million. She slammed the paper down on the glass table. "That is not equity, Governor. That is a betrayal." The reaction was visceral. In the audience, a woman in a military jacket brought her hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. A man in a faded Marine Corps cap clenched his jaw so hard a vein pulsed in his temple. The polite, curated atmosphere of the television set shattered. Newsom laughed, but it was a hollow, nervous sound, a dry rattle in his throat. Those numbers they lack context. You're cherry-picking data to create a culture war. I'm not creating a war, Karoline said, leaning in until she occupied his visual field entirely. I'm fighting the one you declared on the American citizen. For the first time, the invincible governor looked small. He sat blinking into the spotlight, the polished armor of his rhetoric dented, while the audience began to murmur, a low, rumbling sound that sounded suspiciously like an awakening. Gavin Newsom realized the charm offensive was dead. The signature smile, the one that had disarmed debate opponents and charmed donors from Silicon Valley to Napa, vanished entirely. In its place was something colder, harder, the look of a man who was used to being obeyed, not questioned. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, adopting the posture of a disappointed father scolding a naive child. "Karoline," he said, his voice dropping an octave, aiming for gravitas but landing on condescension. "We are talking about humanity. Governing a state the size of a nation isn't about sound bites. It's about making hard choices. California leads with compassion because we understand that diversity is our strength." He looked to the moderator, expecting a lifeline, but the moderator was staring at Karoline, captivated. Karoline didn't blink. She didn't let him finish the pivot. "No, Governor, you don't lead with compassion. You lead with theatrics." She turned slightly, addressing the camera, then whipped her gaze back to him. "You rule by press release. You post photos of yourself holding gold shovels at ribbon-cutting ceremonies for luxury migrant centers, steps away from Skid Row. You hand out hotel vouchers like they're candy on Halloween, while veterans wait 6 months just to get a mental health screening at the VA. Newsom scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "We are fixing the housing crisis. It affects everyone. You're trying to divide us." "Does it affect everyone equally?" Karoline fired back, faster this time. "Because I seem to recall you signing SB 1845. That bill made undocumented immigrants eligible for state-funded home down payment assistance, up to $150,000 in taxpayer money, before American citizens." Newsom froze. His eyes darted sideways. That bill hadn't been mentioned in the mainstream press in months. His team had worked overtime to bury the specifics in bureaucratic jargon. "You think I wouldn't come prepared," Karoline said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Not a smile of joy, but of a hunter closing the trap. "I've seen the receipts. I've spoken to the families. You aren't just funding illegals, Governor. You are prioritizing them over the people who built this country." The audience was no longer just murmuring. The energy had shifted into something kinetic, dangerous to the establishment. The polite facade of the studio was dissolving. Newsom snapped. The cool California breeze persona evaporated. "And what would you have us do, Karoline?" he shouted over the rising noise of the crowd. "Line people up at the border and turn them away at gunpoint? Is that your solution? Cruelty?" The studio went deathly silent. It was the trap Newsom always set, painting his opponent as heartless to save his own moral standing. Karoline didn't retreat. She didn't defend. She attacked. "You don't even know who we are," she said, her voice dropping a register that vibrated with restrained fury. "We are a nation built on law. And when the law means nothing to you, when you reward the ones who break it and punish the ones who defend it, you don't have a state, Gavin." She leaned in, just inches from his face. "You have a circus, and the clowns are running the show." The moderator shifted uncomfortably, signaling for a break, but nobody moved. Newsom's jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. He looked at her with genuine fear, not because she was loud, but because she was right. And for the first time in his career, he realized that no amount of hair gel or donor money could fix the crack she had just put in his reality. Gavin Newsom leaned forward in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the glass table until his knuckles turned white. He knew he was losing. The polished facade was gone, replaced by the desperate aggression of a politician who realizes his talking points have turned to ash in his mouth. He decided to play his final card, the moral trump card he had used to silence critics for a decade. He forced a grin that didn't reach his eyes, a cold, tight expression that looked more like a grimace. "You talk a big game about serving the country, Karoline," he said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "But let me ask you something. How many refugees have you actually spoken to? How many mothers crossing the burning desert with children in their arms have you even looked in the eye?" He paused, letting the question hang there, convinced he had trapped her. He expected her to stumble, to stutter, to offer a statistic. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She stepped forward, not physically, but with a presence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. She looked at him, not with anger, but with a profound, pitying disappointment. "I haven't looked at your photo ops, Governor," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "But I have looked into the eyes of mothers who lost their sons in Afghanistan. I've held the shaking hand of a Marine's father at Arlington National Cemetery as he watched his boy lower into the ground." The studio went silent. Not the polite silence of a television pause, but the suffocating silence of truth. "Don't you dare talk to me about compassion," she continued, her voice rising just enough to shake the rafters, "unless you have stood in their living rooms when the folded flag arrives." Gasps echoed across the room. The moderator's eyes widened, her pen hovering frozen over her notepad. She looked from Newsom to Karoline, unsure whether to intervene, but the audience was rapt. Nobody was checking their phones. Nobody was shifting in their seats. The air was heavy with something rare on live television: reality. Newsom opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. He looked small, shrinking into his expensive suit. Karoline wasn't finished. She turned her body fully toward him, accusing and righteous. "You use the word compassion like a weapon to beat down anyone who asks for order. But compassion without order is just chaos in disguise. And your chaos is killing people." She pointed a finger at him, a gesture that felt like a verdict. "You claim California is a model, but here is the reality you hide. We are $33 trillion in debt. Our cities are crumbling, and our veterans are dying by suicide in cheap motel rooms because the VA is backlogged while your administration hands out state IDs, free legal counsel, and taxpayer-funded luxury housing to people who entered this country illegally." Newsom's face flushed a deep, angry red. "That is a mischaracterization. We are a sanctuary state?" "You are a sanctuary for lawbreakers," Karoline snapped, cutting him off with the force of a whip crack. "And a graveyard for patriots." She took a breath, and then she delivered the line that would ignite the internet before the segment even ended. "Let's be clear, Governor. You don't do this because it's moral. You do it because it's political. Illegal immigrants don't demand accountability yet. They don't vote yet, but they keep your narrative alive." She leaned in, her eyes burning with the fire of 1,000 forgotten promises. "You fund illegals because they are useful to you. You forget veterans because they are inconvenient. You fund illegals, not veterans." The crowd erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a visceral release of years of frustration. A man in the front row, wearing a Vietnam War hat, stood up and shouted, "Tell him!" Another woman was openly weeping, nodding her head violently. Newsom visibly flinched, recoiling as if he had been physically struck. He looked to the moderator, his eyes pleading for the commercial break, for the safety of the backstage, for anywhere but here. But Karoline didn't look at the crowd. She turned directly to the camera, breaking the fourth wall. If fighting for our veterans makes me the enemy of this state's elite, then so be it. I'd rather be hated by the politicians for standing up than loved by them for selling you out." The moderator finally found her voice, though it shook. We have to go to break." But the feed didn't cut away fast enough to hide Gavin Newsom's face. He wasn't just angry. He was afraid. He knew as he watched Karoline Leavitt sit back with the calm of a soldier who had just cleared the battlefield that the world had just seen the one thing he couldn't spin: the truth. The red tally light on camera 1 finally died, plunging the studio back into the cold, harsh reality of the untelevised world. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the breathless, terrifying silence of a vacuum before an explosion. Gavin Newsom didn't move. For the first time in his political career, he didn't immediately turn to his press secretary for a high five or check his phone for praise. He sat frozen, his jaw tight, his eyes wide and darting. He knew what had just happened. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his expensive Italian loafers. His aides were already swarming him like vultures, whispering frantically into earpieces, their faces pale. "Governor, we need to get you out the back," one suit muttered, grabbing Newsom's arm. "Twitter is melting down. The hashtag Veterans Over Illegals is trending #1 globally. They're eating us alive." Newsom pulled his arm away, standing shakily. He looked across the stage at Karoline. He wanted to say something, a snarky comeback, a dismissal, anything to regain his power. But she wasn't looking at him. She was already unclipping her microphone, her movements precise and calm like a soldier cleaning a weapon after a firefight. She didn't need his acknowledgement. She had just ended his narrative. As Newsom was hurried out the back exit to a waiting black SUV, Karoline walked out the front. She didn't go to the exclusive after-party the network had arranged. She walked straight past the producers who were suddenly desperate to book her for a second segment. "Karoline, wait, we can give you prime time tomorrow," one shouted. She didn't turn around. "I don't need your prime time. I'm going to where the real people are." That night, while Newsom's team stayed up till dawn drafting robotic statements about misinformation and complex budget allocations, Karoline boarded a red-eye commercial flight to Ohio. She didn't sleep. She watched as her phone screen lit up like a Christmas tree, thousands of messages from strangers. "I'm a disabled vet. I haven't felt seen in 10 years. Thank you. My son died waiting for the VA. You spoke for him tonight." By the time she landed in Columbus, the clip of her destroying Newsom had been viewed 40 million times. But Karoline didn't go to a hotel to rest. She went straight to the local war memorial. Under a steel gray sky, with no cameras and no press, she walked toward the granite wall etched with the names of the fallen. A small crowd had already gathered. Not political operatives, but men in battered ball caps and denim jackets, women holding pictures of sons they would never see again. An older man leaning heavily on a cane stepped forward. He was wearing an army field jacket that had seen better decades. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of dog tags, the metal worn smooth with time and worry. "I was gonna throw these in the river," the man whispered, his voice cracking. "I thought this country forgot us. I thought nobody gave a damn anymore." He placed the tags in Karoline's hand, his grip trembling. "Then I saw you last night. You made me believe again." Karoline closed her fingers around the cold metal. She looked at the man, her eyes glistening but fierce. "I didn't do it for the applause," she said softly. "I did it because it's the truth, and we are done being silent." That evening, a rally of 12,000 people overflowed the fairgrounds. There were no teleprompters, no focus group speeches. When Karoline walked onto the stage, the roar was deafening, a sound that shook the earth. It wasn't the cheer of a campaign, it was the roar of an awakening.
She stepped to the mic, the dog tags clutched in her hand. They thought they could buy us off with crumbs while they sold our country out the back door. They thought we would stay quiet while they put foreign nationals before American heroes. But last night, we sent them a message they will never forget. The crowd chanted back, a single unified voice, USA, USA, USA. This isn't just a moment, this is a movement, and we are coming for everything they stole. Newsom was in a mansion in Sacramento, watching the feed on a tablet, terrified. Karoline was in the mud of Ohio, standing with the people, fearless. The debate was over. The war for the soul of America had just begun. The media wants you to believe that what you just read is fiction. They want you to believe that the betrayal of our veterans is just a complex policy issue. But you know the truth. You see it in your grocery stores, on your streets, and in your paychecks. The story of Karoline standing up to the elite isn't just a story, it's a blueprint. But the message only spreads if you help carry it.